The sun was shining brightly over our backyard in Indianapolis. It was a perfect Saturday for a graduation party. My son Leo had just finished elementary school, and he was beaming with pride in his little cap and gown. We had invited a few neighbors and some of his friends for pizza and cake. My husband, Mark, was busy at the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with his buddies. Everything felt normal and happy. Then, the mail carrier arrived with a large, heavy box wrapped in bright blue paper. The return address was from Mark's parents, the people who always claimed they knew what was best for our family. Leo's eyes went wide with excitement as he saw the package. He loved gifts from his grandparents because they usually went overboard with expensive toys. He sat down on the grass and began to tear the paper away. Underneath was a massive high-end building set he had wanted for months. He lifted the box up to show everyone, his smile stretching from ear to ear. But as he turned the box to look at the side, his expression shifted. The joy drained from his face instantly. He pointed at a small, dark corner inside the clear plastic lining. "Mom, why is this thing blinking?" he asked softly. I felt a sudden chill despite the summer heat. I walked over and knelt beside Leo. Everyone else was still laughing and talking, not noticing the change in the air. I looked where Leo was pointing. Tucked deep into the corner of the box, behind the heavy cardboard layers, was a tiny red light. It flickered every few seconds like a heartbeat. It was hidden so well that you would only see it if you held the box at a specific angle. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, who had just arrived at the party, suddenly froze. She had been walking toward us with a plate of appetizers, but she stopped dead in her tracks. Mark stepped over, looking confused. He glanced at the box and gave a nervous laugh. "It's probably just a mistake, Leo," he said, though his voice sounded tight. "Maybe it's part of the packaging or a piece of the toy that fell out of place." I didn't believe him. I reached for the box and ran my fingers along the bottom lining. I felt something hard, square, and cold sewn directly into the fabric of the box's internal carrying case. Leo looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp fear. "Mom, is someone following me?" I didn't answer right away. I pulled a small pocket knife from my gardening belt and carefully slit the fabric. A small black plastic square fell into my palm. It was a GPS tracking device, the kind that uses a SIM card for live updates. Beatrice dropped her plate of food and rushed over. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hard. "Give that to me right now," she demanded, her voice rising. "You are overreacting as usual. It's for safety. Grandparents have a right to know where their grandchild is at all times. The world is a dangerous place." I looked at her, then at the device in my hand. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a manufacturing error. It was a deliberate choice. Mark stood behind his mother, nodding slowly. "She's just worried about him, honey," he said. "Think about how many kids go missing these days." It was a gift of protection. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't panic on her face. It was the look of a person who had been caught but was determined to win the argument. My neighbor, who works in tech, leaned over and whispered, "That's a high-end model. It updates a live map every 10 seconds. The air in the backyard felt heavy and toxic. I looked at the happy faces of Leo's friends and felt a surge of protectiveness. "The party is over," I announced, my voice steady but loud. "Everyone, please go home. Now." The neighbors looked shocked, and Leo started to cry. He didn't understand why his big day was being ruined. Mark grabbed my arm, his face turning a deep shade of red. "Are you serious? You're making a scene in front of everyone over a safety feature." I ignored him and led Leo inside the house. I could hear Beatrice screaming at the neighbors to stay, telling them I was unstable and having a moment. I locked the back door and took the device to my office. That night, after Leo finally fell asleep, I pulled up the serial number on the back of the tracker. I went to the manufacturer's website and tried to find the registration. It didn't take long. The device was registered to Beatrice's personal email address. Had been activated 3 weeks ago. She hadn't just put it in the box. She had been testing it long before the graduation ever happened. My heart pounded against my ribs as I realized how deep this went. As I sat in the dark office, memories started flashing before my eyes like a bad movie. I thought about all the times Beatrice had accidentally run into us at the park or the grocery store. I remembered her making comments about Leo's nutrition after I had taken him for a secret ice cream treat across town. At the time, I thought she was just being nosy or had a good memory for details. Now, the pattern snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. This wasn't the first tracker. She had been stalking us. I went to her social media page and began scrolling through her recent photos. I found several pictures of Leo playing at a specific trail we had visited a month ago, a trail I had never mentioned to her. The photos were taken from a distance, hidden behind trees. She was following us. She was mapping our lives. I felt like the walls were closing in. Every time I had felt like I was being watched, I had told myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't. The evidence was right there on the screen, hidden in plain sight under the guise of a doting grandmother. I realized then that I was living in a house of mirrors. The next morning, the house was silent and cold. Mark hadn't come to bed. I found him sleeping on the couch, still wearing his clothes from the party. I didn't say a word to him. I went back to the Lego box, which was still sitting on my office floor. I wanted to see if there was anything else hidden inside. I started taking out the bags of bricks and the instruction manual. As I pulled out the cardboard base, I noticed a slight bulge in the side of the box that didn't match the other side. I felt along the cardboard and found a second hidden compartment, taped over with matching tape. I used my scissors to carefully peel it back. Inside was a thick yellow envelope. There was no festive card inside. Instead, I pulled out several sheets of heavy legal-grade paper. It was a formal document folded tight. My breath hitched in my throat as I read the heading at the top of the first page. It wasn't a gift at all. It was a Trojan horse. The blue wrapping paper had been hiding a legal attack that was designed to destroy my life and take my son away from me. The document was a draft petition for temporary emergency guardianship. My heart stopped as I read the allegations written in cold legal language. It claimed that I was mentally unstable and incapable of providing a safe environment for Leo. It cited unexplained outbursts and paranoid behavior. Most shocking of all, it listed Mark as a supporting witness. The paper suggested that because of my supposed instability and Mark's demanding work schedule, the child should be placed in the care of his paternal grandparents immediately. My hands began to shake so hard I almost dropped the papers. This was a calculated strike. They were waiting for me to react to the tracker so they could use my anger as proof of my instability. I walked into the living room and threw the papers onto Mark's lap. He jumped awake, blinking at the bright morning light. "What is this, Mark?" I screamed. He looked at the papers, and for a split second, I saw a flash of guilt in his eyes before he masked it with anger. "It's just a draft," he muttered, looking away. "My mother was just looking into options in case something happened to you." "In case something happened to me?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "Mark, this says you have concerns about my parenting. You've been talking to a lawyer behind my back while I was making dinner and tucking our son into bed." Mark stood up, trying to look imposing, but he just looked small and cowardly. "You've been acting stressed lately, okay? My mom said we needed a backup plan. She said you were starting to lose it." I realized in that moment that my marriage hadn't just been failing. It had been quietly undermined for months. Every disagreement we had, every time I was tired or frustrated, he had been reporting back to Beatrice. She was feeding his doubts and coaching him on how to build a case against me. He wasn't my partner. He was a spy in my own home. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked at the man I had loved for 12 years and realized I didn't know him at all. He had traded his wife and his son's peace for his mother's approval. Something inside me snapped. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I didn't argue with him any further. I knew that anything I said would be twisted and used in that petition. I went back to my room, locked the door, and searched for the best family lawyer in the state. I found a woman named Evelyn who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. I called her office the second they opened. When I explained the situation, the tracker in the gift and the hidden legal documents, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded deeply alarmed. "This is a sophisticated level of interference," she told me over the phone. "The fact that they hid legal papers in a child's toy tells me they are playing for keeps. They wanted you to find them and have a breakdown." She told me to stay calm and not to confront Mark or Beatrice again. "Keep the tracker. Do not turn it off. Let them think they are still monitoring you. We need to see exactly what they are doing while they think you are unaware." I took a deep breath and agreed. I had to become a better actor than they were. I had to protect Leo, and that meant being the most stable version of myself. Evelyn's team worked fast. Since the tracker was registered and active, they were able to subpoena the location history through a private investigator. When I saw the data, I felt sick to my stomach. The tracker's history showed weeks of monitoring. It wasn't just the trail or the grocery store. It showed the device had been at Leo's school, at his best friend's house, and even at the dentist's office. Beatrice had been mapping Leo's entire world. She knew his routine down to the minute. She knew which park he liked and which route we took to get there. My child was being digitally mapped like a piece of cargo. It was a level of obsession that went far beyond concerned grandmother. As I went over the logs with Evelyn, she looked at me with a grim expression. "She's building a timeline of your movements to prove you are unpredictable," she explained. Then she asked a question that I hadn't even considered. Does your mother-in-law have access to your bank accounts or any shared family finances? I told her she shouldn't, but Mark and I had a joint account. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't checked our statements in months. I went to the bank that afternoon while Mark was at work. I sat in a small cubicle with a bank officer and requested the last 6 months of statements for our joint savings and checking accounts. As the printer hummed, I prayed I was wrong. But when the pages slid across the desk, the truth was written in black and white. There were large, regular withdrawals, sums of $3,000, $5,000, and even $10,000. They were labeled as loans or investments. Every single one of them had been routed through a secondary account that Mark had set up, and from there, the money disappeared. I looked closer at the digital memos on the transfers. One payment memo for $5,000 simply read, BB legal fees. Beatrice's initials. Mark had been using our family's life savings to fund his mother's legal battle against me. He was paying for the very lawyer who was trying to take his son away. I felt a cold rage settle into my bones. I wasn't just being stalked, I was being robbed. The financial trail was the final piece of the puzzle. They weren't just looking for guardianship. They were trying to drain me of every resource so I couldn't fight back. I took the bank statements straight to Evelyn. She looked them over and smiled, though it wasn't a kind look. They've made a massive mistake, she said. This is financial abuse and conspiracy. We have them exactly where we want them. She told me to go home and act like nothing was wrong. Invite them to dinner, she suggested. Be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. Let them think their plan is working and that you've calmed down about the tracker. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I went home, cooked a large roast, and called Beatrice. I apologized for my outburst at the party and told her I was just overwhelmed by the graduation. She sounded smug over the phone, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I knew you'd see reason, dear, she said. We just want what's best for Leo. Mark was relieved when he came home to a hot meal and a smiling wife. He thought he had successfully gaslit me into submission. He had no idea that every word he said from that moment on was being carefully documented. The trap was set and they were walking right into it. The dinner was a masterclass in deception. Beatrice and her husband arrived wearing their best clothes, looking like the picture of grandfatherly grace. Over the meal, Beatrice began to brag, too casually, about the importance of family legacy and stability. She kept glancing at Leo, who was sitting quietly, still confused by the tension of the previous days. It's so important for a child to have a rock-solid foundation, she said, sipping her wine. Sometimes parents get so caught up in their own issues that they forget what the child needs. Mark stayed silent, staring at his plate, but he nodded whenever his mother spoke. Beatrice started hinting that the courts in our county strongly preferred households with two-parent stability and deep financial roots. She was basically telling me to my face that she was going to take my son, and she thought I was too broken to notice the threat. I just smiled and offered her more wine. I felt like I was watching a predator boast before a hunt, unaware that the fence had already been moved. My lawyer had told me to let them talk, and Beatrice loved nothing more than the sound of her own voice. Halfway through the dessert, I excused myself to check on the coffee in the kitchen. I left my phone on the sideboard, right near where Beatrice was sitting. It was set to record. I stood in the kitchen, my heart racing, and listened through the cracked door. The second I was out of the room, Beatrice's voice changed. It became sharp and cold. You see, Mark. She's weak, she hissed. She'll fold the second we file the emergency papers. The tracker showed she's been to that therapist 3 times this month. We'll use that. We'll say she's having a breakdown. I heard Mark mumble something I couldn't catch, but then Beatrice continued. The tracker was just the first step. We need to make sure she has no money left to hire a decent lawyer. Once we have temporary custody, we'll move him to the lake house. She won't be able to find him. My blood ran cold. They were planning to hide my son. I waited a few more minutes, then walked back in with a tray of mugs. I was shaking, but I kept my face neutral. Everything okay? Asked brightly. Beatrice smiled her plastic smile. Just perfect, dear. Just perfect. As the night went on, Beatrice became even bolder. She started criticizing my parenting style, my job, and even my family background. She told Leo he would be much happier spending the summer at the lake with them because they had real structure. Mark finally spoke up, but it wasn't to defend me. Mom's right, honey. We need to think about what's better for him long-term. Maybe a change of scenery would be good for everyone. Something in me hardened into a diamond. I looked at Mark and saw a stranger. I looked at Beatrice and saw a monster. I realized that if I didn't act now, I would lose Leo forever. These people didn't love him. They wanted to own him. They wanted to mold him into a version of Mark that would never leave them. I stood up and cleared the table. "I want to thank you both for being so honest tonight," I said. My voice was calm and clear. "It's really helpful to know exactly where everyone stands." They looked at me, confused by my tone, but they just assumed I was finally surrendering. They left the house that night feeling victorious. They had no idea it was the last time they would ever step foot in my home. 2 days later, the hammer dropped. I waited until Mark was at his office. My lawyer's process server arrived and handed him 3 separate sets of papers: a petition for divorce, a request for emergency sole custody, and a restraining order regarding surveillance and stalking. At the same time, a second server arrived at Beatrice's house. She was served with a lawsuit for financial fraud and a domestic violence injunction. I had already moved Leo and myself to a secure location that morning. When Mark called me, his voice was a mixture of shock and screaming rage. "What have you done?" he shrieked. "You can't do this. You're proving everything my mother said about you." I didn't say a word. I simply hung up and blocked his number. Then the calls from Beatrice started. She left screaming voicemails, threatening to destroy me and making sure I knew that I would never see a dime of their money. I saved every single one of them. Each voicemail was just more evidence for the pile. The stable grandmother was showing her true face, and it was terrifying. The first court hearing was a week later. The courtroom was small and quiet, but the tension was explosive. Beatrice sat with her husband and their high-priced lawyer, looking indignant. Mark sat next to them, looking pale and defeated. Their lawyer started by arguing that I was a flight risk, and that Beatrice had only placed the tracker out of abundant caution for a grandchild she loved. He tried to paint me as a hysterical woman who was overreacting to a family disagreement. Then my lawyer Evelyn stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She simply presented the evidence. She showed the GPS logs that proved weeks of stalking. She played the recording from the dinner party where Beatrice talked about folding me and hiding Leo at the lake house. She presented the bank statements showing the stolen money. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience, went completely silent as she listened to Beatrice's own voice plotting to kidnap my son. The air in the room shifted. You could feel the weight of the evidence crushing their defense. The judge looked over her glasses at Beatrice, then turned her gaze to Mark. "Mr. Brooks, please stand," the judge said coldly. Mark stood up, his knees shaking. The judge questioned him directly about his role in the financial transfers and the tracking device. He tried to lie at first, saying he didn't know the full extent of his mother's plans. But Evelyn was ready. She produced emails between Mark and Beatrice where they discussed the guardianship strategy and the GPS monitoring. Mark's face turned gray. He couldn't deny it anymore. He looked at his mother for help, but Beatrice was busy staring at the ceiling, trying to look like a victim. The judge's voice was like ice. "You collaborated with your mother to stalk your own wife and child, and you used marital funds to do it," the judge said. "This is not concern, Mr. Brooks. This is a conspiracy to commit custodial interference." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The judge then did something I didn't expect. She requested that Child Protective Services be brought in to investigate the grandparents' home immediately. She wasn't just looking at my instability anymore. She was looking at the toxic environment Beatrice had created. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped over entirely. By the end of the hearing, the judge had made a series of rapid-fire rulings. Beatrice's petition for guardianship was not just dismissed. It was called bad faith litigation. A permanent restraining order was issued, barring Beatrice and her husband from any contact with Leo or me. They were banned from coming within 500 feet of his school or our home. The judge issued a scathing warning, stating that any attempt to use digital tracking in the future would result in immediate jail time. Mark was granted only supervised visitation, which had to take place at a secure facility. The judge was clear. Until he could prove he was independent of his mother's influence, he was not a safe parent. Beatrice tried to stand up and protest, screaming that she was the matriarch and had rights. The bailiff had to move toward her to get her to sit down. The judge didn't even look at her. She turned her attention to me, and for the first time, her expression softened. I felt a lump form in my throat. I had spent so long being told I was the problem that I had almost started to believe it. "I want to acknowledge the restraint shown by the mother in this case," the judge said, looking directly at me. "To discover your child is being tracked and to stay calm enough to build a legal case is a sign of extreme stability and care." I burst into tears. It was the first time in months that I felt truly seen. All the gaslighting, the hidden papers, and the secret meetings were finally over. The judge granted me full temporary custody of Leo and gave me exclusive use of our home. Mark was ordered to move out immediately under police supervision. He looked at me across the courtroom like I was a stranger. He couldn't believe that the weak wife he had tried to undermine had just systematically dismantled his entire life. But I wasn't a stranger. I was just the woman he had stopped listening to. I had done what I had to do to protect my son. As we walked out of the courtroom, Beatrice tried to lunge toward me, shouting that I would pay for this. The bailiffs intercepted her and led her out in handcuffs for contempt of court. It was a fitting end to her reign of terror. The fallout was messy. Mark moved back into his parents' house, which was the very thing he had been trying to avoid for years. Without the stolen money from our joint account, Beatrice's lifestyle began to crumble. She had spent a fortune on lawyers and investigations that had ultimately backfired. I heard through friends that she blamed Mark for failing to control me. They turned on each other, their toxic bond finally breaking under the pressure of their own making. Mark tried to send me emails through his lawyer, begging for a second chance, saying he had been brainwashed. I didn't respond. A man who would help his mother stalk his son doesn't get a second chance. He had made his choice at that graduation party, and now he had to live with it. My lawyer told me that Beatrice was facing a formal investigation for the financial fraud, and it was likely she would have to pay back every cent she had taken from our accounts. The consequences were finally landing, and they were heavy. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The house was quiet, but it was a good quiet. A few weeks later, the final legal boundaries were in place. A formal cease and desist was issued to the entire Brooks family. The court ordered financial restitution, and Mark was forced to sign over his share of the house as part of the divorce settlement. There were no more accidental run-ins at the park. No more concerned messages. Only silence. Leo was slowly starting to understand that his grandparents wouldn't be around anymore. One night, as I was tucking him in, he asked me if we were finally safe. I looked at his small, innocent face and felt a wave of relief. Yes, Leo, I told him. We are safe. No one is following us anymore. He hugged me tight and fell asleep almost instantly. He was finally sleeping through the night again, without the night terrors that had plagued him for months. I realized that his subconscious had known something was wrong long before I did. Children are intuitive like that. They can feel the blinking lights in their lives even when they can't see them. We were starting over, and for the first time the future looked bright. We eventually decided to move to a different part of the city. I wanted a fresh start in a house that didn't have memories of Mark and Beatrice lurking in the corners. We established new routines. Saturday morning pancakes, bike rides in the park, and movie nights every Friday. I put Leo in therapy to help him process the trauma of the spying, and the therapist said he was making incredible progress. He started to laugh again, that deep belly laugh that I hadn't heard in so long. Laughter returned to our lives slowly, but it was real. One afternoon a package arrived in the mail. It was a large envelope from the school photographer. I opened it and found Leo's official elementary graduation photos. In the pictures, he was wearing his blue cap and gown, holding his diploma. He looked so small and so brave. I remembered that day, the heat, the pizza, and the blue-wrapped box. Felt like a lifetime ago. I realized how close I had come to losing him, and how lucky I was that he had been the one to point out the truth. I chose one of the photos and put it in a beautiful wooden frame. It was a picture of Leo smiling, his eyes bright and unafraid. I hung it in our new living room, right where everyone could see it. It was a reminder of his strength. This time there were no hidden compartments, no trackers, no strings attached. Just a boy who had graduated from one part of his life and was moving into a better one. I looked at the photo and realized that this entire battle had never really been about revenge. It wasn't about winning against Beatrice or punishing Mark. It was about creating a world where my son could grow up without being a pawn in someone else's game. It was about his right to be free. I felt a deep sense of gratitude. If Beatrice hadn't sent that gift, I might still be living in that house of mirrors, wondering why I felt so watched. Her greed and her need for control had been her own undoing. She had handed me the key to my own prison, and I had been smart enough to turn it. I think about that moment in the backyard often. I think about Leo's small finger pointing at that tiny blinking red light. I realize now that he didn't just point at a piece of plastic. He pointed at the truth of our entire family dynamic. He pointed at the rot that was hidden beneath the perfect surface. He was the one who saw what shouldn't be there, and he was the one who had the courage to ask why. The moment I chose to listen to him, everything changed. I stopped being the shadow and became the protector. I stopped accepting the lies and started demanding the truth. We are free now. We are happy. And every time I look at Leo, I am reminded that sometimes, the best gift you can receive is the one that forces you to open your eyes. My parents-in-law sent a graduation present that they thought would give them control. Instead, it gave us our lives back. And that is a gift I will cherish forever.